and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And it is that time of year when the city works to prepare its annual budget and spending for the long-term future. And as always, we want you to be involved in the process. Here to tell you how is Brian DeProfio. Welcome.
Hello, how are you doing today?
Good.
That's good.
You're in charge of budget and strategic projects,
Yes.
which makes this work together really well.
Yes. It covers a broad range of issues.
Right, and especially this year, we're going to look at things a little differently. But first of all, I just want to remind people, it feels like routine that we ask citizens to help us prepare the budget instead of react to a budget that is prepared by staff. And Hampton has won a lot of awards and recognition for that.
Yes, and one of the things that we take a great deal of pride in is getting public input really on the front end in developing the budget, so that, as you had noted, we, most communities wait to have public hearings after the budget has already been released and those sorts of things. But at that point, it's very difficult to kind of react to what the public's desires are. So we try to get that input on the front end so that we can get the citizens' involvement and reflect the citizens' values and interest in the budget process.
Yeah, and I think that values is a key piece of it. And of course, we've called it I Value. Mary Bunting named it her very first year, because we don't, it's not helpful necessarily, and citizens can't understand, well, are we spending too much on gasoline? Well, like the details of the budget, but so we talk about what services they want, what level of service, what their expectations are, challenged against what they're willing to pay for, because, I want a much bigger house than the one I own. I know I can't pay for it.
Right.
We have to make some compromises.
Right.
So just a brief overview, because I know you've already given council 2 presentations and you have some more in the days ahead. But what do we know so far about what the coming budget is going to look like? Let's start with revenues.
Well, on the revenue side, the city assessor had briefed the council at a meeting in January, where he basically had identified that we're really only seeing about a 0.65% growth in assessments of real estate. And real estate is our largest revenue source, and so really one of the things that that's suggesting, or that we're going to have to deal with, is the fact that the revenues still haven't come back to sort of a normal growth level. And a normal growth level would probably be, in the more 2 to 3% range. That's what we experienced before the housing boom.
Well,
and
yeah,
then of course,
right.
then
the boom was crazy.
The boom was crazy, and then the crash.
The fall was crazy.
Yeah, we're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of the crash, really, in our assessments at this point.
So we're going to see some revenue growth, but maybe not even quite at the level of where inflation is, much less anything else that we want to add. Now, we might get some other better news ahead. I know meals tax has been outperforming some of the other things because more people are actually eating out now than cooking at home. And some other things might counter that, but it's not going to be a great picture.
No, it's not going to be a great picture. The first thing that we really get is the assessments in the process, just the way the timing works out. And the finance director actually does the revenue projections, because we have sort of the budget takes care of the expenses, and finance does the revenue projections, so that we have that little checks and balances in the process. And so he's working with some of the other stakeholders, like the Commissioner of Revenue and Treasurer, to look at some of our other taxes, like the sales tax, the meals tax, the personal property tax. And then he will be doing a presentation, I think in March, to council, where he'll basically outline what the revenue picture looks like.
The state is an important part of our budget because they fund or partially fund several of the services that are actually delivered, at City Hall or at some of the other city facilities. I know for many years now, Hampton has had line items in their budget that explain unfunded mandates and things the state has said they were going to pay for, or even years when the state said, Hampton, send us back a check because we can't balance our own budget. How does that, it got better last year. How does it look for this year?
For this year, it looks like it's probably going to be flat. We may get a little bit of additional money for our constitutional officers, people like the Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, Sheriffs, the Clerk of Court, and the Commonwealth's Attorney, based on what the Governor has put out as budget amendments, as well as what the House and Senate have put out. They all have different ways of looking at it, 3 different groups involved in the budget process, and that'll need to be reconciled over the coming weeks. and then we'll have a better sense of what it overall looks like. But right now, from a city perspective, city government, it looks like it'll be flat. One of the big challenges is really on our school side, because the state last year had indicated that it would be giving the schools some additional money so they can provide teacher raises. They ultimately decided that they couldn't do that because the revenue projections were lower than what they had projected in the budget process. And so the schools really are having some challenges with their budget, because they had already committed to giving those raises. They gave those raises. They used so they cut some other areas of their budget, and they also used some one-time sources. So they kind of went into the FY18 budget, which is the budget that we're all working on right now, with a little bit of a deficit situation because of what the state had done.
And they didn't expect that. You know, they knew they were going to use local money to start the raises early, but the state money was supposed to kick in.
Right.
And then the state had said, well, that's contingent on our revenues. The revenues didn't make, so kind of pulled the rug out there, which I mean, they said going in it's contingent on revenues, but you want to provide raises to teachers and make a commitment to your staff, because they've had a tough time. Right.
And so they're looking at probably, you know, they've briefed their school board on it. They're looking at like a $4 million budget gap that they're wrestling with.
And out of the gate.
Out of the gate.
Anything else.
Yeah, out of the gate before they add any raises for the teachers. So that's one of the challenges that they have. And, you know, a good chunk of the money that the schools get does come from the state. And so that has a big impact on their budget. We don't get as much money from the state for our budget. So that's where a lot of the impacts from the state tend to be. But, you know, sometimes the state comes and they've not indicated they're going to do that this year, and they ask for essentially what we call local aid to the state, which is basically they ask us to cut a check to them to help them balance their budget. In past years, that's been, you know, close to $1 million, which does have a big impact on us. And so, you know, but this year it looks like, you know, we might not expect a whole lot of additional revenue from the state, but it doesn't look like they're going to ask us to cut them a check like they have done in past years.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Now, another challenge that we face is there's going to be some potential increases in spending in the city this year. I know they've been saying at council for several months now that the police are asking to put some more officers on the street to combat some of the drugs, gangs, and gun violence that's going on now. Yeah,
we have essentially a few different issues with the police. First is we were able to actually get what's called a COPS grant, which is a federal grant that can help fund some officers on the street. So we got a COPS grant for 5 officers. There's a local match component of that, and then there's also some costs that the federal grant doesn't cover, things like equipping the officers, buying them vehicles, and those sorts of things.
Right.
So in the
that was this year.
Right. In the FY17 budget, we got that grant, so we're able to add 5 officers in FY17 mid-year, and so we're going to need to pick up the cost of that in FY18, the local share of that cost, and then also we're looking to add additional officers in FY18. Up to 7, and so, you know, that's another thing that we're trying to fit into the budget. Again, in the context of you know, revenues really not growing at a robust level at this point.
So there's going to be some choices to be made, and we're going to be asking the citizens to help us with those choices and let us know what their values are in terms of city services and spending and all that.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing we're going to do differently this year is capital projections. We do capital normally on a 5-year plan, and it's been pretty much a maintenance budget as long as I've been with the city now, because there's been so much pressure on the budget and on the revenues. You know, you're asked to state whether you support maintenance of schools or maintenance of city buildings, and you kind of have to. You can't let the roof cave in. So, but this year, because council has been talking about taking on some additional spending for, especially for economic development. So how are we going to involve the citizens in that piece?
Well, as you had mentioned, we basically have a two-framed process now with the CIP. One where we'll
CIP, wait, we don't use acronyms. It is
Capital Improvement Plan,
there you go.
which is the 5-year plan. But basically, as you had mentioned, we've historically, over the last number of years, been at a maintenance level in the Capital Improvement Plan. And so we have that process, and then we've taken another process, which we call Council Strategic Priorities. And we've been working with Council during the fall and into the winter months, basically identifying strategic priorities that we're going to take to the community at our public input sessions and get their perspective on what of those priorities. Like you said, there's economic development type projects like the Downtown Seafood Initiative, the Aquatic Center, and things like that that have been talked about, in the public for some time.
And just to remind people, the Aquatic Center is a hybrid. Like half of it is replacing community facilities. So there's a community use recreation component. But then the concept, at least, is that the revenues from the competition facility would help fund the ongoing operating cost of that facility and make more economic sense to do them both at once than either separately.
Yes. So we're going to go, one of the things that we're going to do is we've had a variety of projects, and we wanted to say, okay, let's look at the full universe of projects that we've been talking about with Council, and that's been talked about in the community, and let's see which ones are our highest priorities to pursue. And so we're going to go through that process with the public as we do our public engagement this winter. So that's a little bit different. And so, as you had noted, in the past it's been maintenance level. This might be a little bit more interesting for folks because we're going to look at some investments that will help move the community forward.
And we're going to look potentially 10 years out rather than just 5. So that, let me ask you a question. A lot of people, a lot of taxpayers get very nervous when they hear that the city's borrowing money. And I think, if you can relate it to a household level, they think it's like credit card debt. But it's not really like, it's more like a mortgage for things that are going to add value. So how does the financial community look at whether or not we borrow money and what our rules are about how much we borrow?
Well, I think one of the things that the financial community likes to see is a community that's reinvesting in itself. And so that's one key component. Another key
so if we don't borrow money, it's like we're not keeping up our house. We're not adding value to what we already own. Right.
And so, they'll look at it and they'll say, okay, this community may not be keeping up with the maintenance and the other things that it needs to do in order to be a viable community. And so, then they'll maybe, take that into consideration when they're looking at the at your credit rating and say, this might be an issue down the road that they're going to have to deal with. They're just kicking the can down the road on some of these things. So, so it's important to continue to reinvest. And one of the things that we've done over the last couple of years is we've tried to keep our debt service level in order to make sure that we can, manage our overall budget during a slow growth period.
So let me just, so debt service means the amount we spend every year. So it comes from that recurring revenue to pay on the bonds. So it's like our mortgage payments.
Correct. And so we've kept that flat the last few years. And given, and just to sort of put some perspective on what we were talking about earlier with revenues, we actually had declining assessments for a number of years. We are starting to see growth. And so we do see that in future years, there's probably going to be some capacity to increase debt service, which you can't keep debt service level forever, because the cost of things go up and those sorts of things, and you need to be able to keep your community sustainable and deal with the maintenance issues and economic growth issues that you're trying to do to be a sustainable community. But so basically, they look at that. They look at how you manage your debt, and we have very conservative debt management policies in place that have been in place for decades now that they look very favorably on. So we are a AA plus rated community, which is the second highest rating you can get from rating agencies. So we do manage our debt levels very well, and we have been keeping it flat the last few years as we've been dealing with low revenue growth. We do anticipate that we will need to start increasing debt service probably when we had a conversation with Council at their last meeting in January. We talked about maybe increasing them by about $300,000 a year. Currently, our debt service is about $33 million, increasing about $300,000 a year starting in 2020. And again, we'll give ourselves 2018 and 2019 to kind of continue to see those assessments
because we're seeing
grow.
that it's going to be slow.
Yeah.
And all of Hampton Roads is, this is not a Hampton phenomenon.
No,
this is jobs and employment and dependence on federal spending and things that are affecting all of Hampton Roads and much of the country.
Yeah, and that's the big picture is the economy needs to grow at large in the United States. And our regional economy needs to grow. A couple of years ago, the economists at Old Dominion University in the state of the region said that if it were not for a couple major contracts that Newport News Shipyard got, then the region would be in recession.
Oh, geez.
Now, so we've been kind of a slow growth area, mainly because we've been so dependent on federal spending, and with the sequestration, with cutbacks in military spending and those sorts of things, it's been really a drag on our economy here regionally. And so we've not recovered at the same rate as other places that aren't as reliant on federal spending.
Well, and that also really points to why Council is looking at strategic investments that are designed to grow tax revenues and grow jobs. I mean, Downtown Seafood Initiative, building some work in downtown, additional things in Coliseum Central, which is the retail engine of the city. In terms of getting boosts that can then later be applied to areas of quality of life or other parts of town, is giving those economic engines a little bit of a shot.
Yeah, and one of the other things to look at in that context is the economic focus that we've had in our economic growth strategies really are looking at diversifying our economy as well. And the downtown seafood to sort of diversify our that element of our economy, and then sports and amateur tourism, and amateur sports tourism to again to diversify our economy.
Bring in a little more tourists. You've got,
and so you're not as reliant on the federal government.
They pay us more in taxes than it costs to sustain them. So they're a wonderful boost when they happen.
Right. So again, and to have really a strong economy, you really need to diversify, and so we need to be a little bit less dependent on the federal government, and that's true for the entire region.
Yeah.
And those are some of the strategies we're putting forward to try to get there.
Okay, so we've given people a little bit of a briefing on what they can expect. There are 3 in-person opportunities to give input about the budget. We will have online opportunities. There will be meetings with various groups that will all be organized later. But for now, we have these 3 key dates, which we're going to put up on the screen. And tell us how they're different.
The first meeting will be February 21st, and that will be basically a town hall style where we'll ask people to give their input. We'll basically be doing a budget 101. Here's how our budget works. Here are kind of the key things that drive our budget, to give people some background on the way the overall budget works, and then sort of an open forum for them to provide their feedback and comments and thoughts about the budget in general.
Right. And so what we found last year was when we were talking about the operating budget, a lot of people had general questions or general comments like, why can't we do this? Or can we do this? And so we thought we would give them a chance to have that forum. And
one of the questions that we get all the time is, okay, if you're looking at spending X amount of money, like the Aquatic Center is $32 million, if you're looking at why can't you use that to do pay raises and those sorts of things.
Why can't you hire police officers with that money? And so the one-time borrowed capital money can't go to that.
Correct. So we kind of hit on some issues like that so that folks can kind of understand that and give them an opportunity to ask those questions, better understand how the budget works. And then the second meeting will be focused on the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that.
And we'll ask the public what they think and what their priorities are, these various projects that we've been talking to council about for a while.
And we think we will do that in a pretty similar way that we ask council, which are the most important to you. But within that category, for growing taxes, for building the economy, and for fun, wonderful things that enhance your quality of life.
Correct. And what we did with the council is we basically asked them to put them in one of three tiers. Tier 1 would be their most important, Tier 2 would be sort of their second most important, and Tier 3 would be ones that are, you know, on the lower end of the scale. And so that way we were able to basically get a sense of what ones were most important and kind of focus on trying to find a way to fund those. So that will be the key focus of the CIP public input session. And then the third session will really focus on the operating budget, and we'll ask questions about you know, the public safety investments. We'll probably ask questions about one of the things that we talked to council about 2 years ago was some fee adjustments in our things like our solid waste fund, which, you know, we need to continue to look at the fees and that make sure that we're covering the cost of solid waste, because it's an independent part of the budget. It's not part of our what we call our general fund budget.
It's a user fee, not general tax dollars.
So we'll ask questions about that, and we'll ask some other questions that we identify as being things that we really need some feedback from the public to help put our operating budget together.
Okay, so that's the plan. There will be an online component to follow, which we haven't entirely figured out. There will probably be an online chat, which hasn't quite been scheduled yet, but there are lots of opportunities for people to make their voice heard.
That's correct.
Okay. Anything else you want to add before we close?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for watching. I do hope to see you at some of the in-person forums. They are a lot more flexible and interesting and offer the opportunity for more give and take. But we understand that many of us are very, very busy, and we can spare the time to do an online questionnaire on our own time and not necessarily come out in public. Whatever you choose to do, we do want to hear your voice in this year's I Value Budget Development. Thanks for watching.